Welcome to Hope is Here. My name is Greg Horn. We are continuing our series, Who is This Man? And we are looking at Jesus. We're basing a lot of this off a book called Who is This Man that by John Ortberg. It was written a few years ago, but some of it comes from that, and a lot of it's coming just from my 60 years of living on this earth, over 40 being a follower of Jesus, and things that Jesus has taught me. And we kicked this series off on Mondays and Tuesdays 3 weeks ago, looking at first, who is the man that was bigger than religion? And then we looked at the man who redefined what greatness means. And then last but not least, we redefined the man who redefined love. The man who redefined love. And I had a lot of good feedback on these programs that we've been doing on Mondays and Tuesdays in this series. If you missed any of them, I would encourage you to go to our website, hopeisheretoday.org. That's hopeisheretoday.org. Also want to remind you, we have a YouTube channel, and most of our programs are on there. So you can find us on YouTube. Just simply type in Hope is Here and my name, Greg Horn, Horn. And hope you'll subscribe to our YouTube channel. Helps other people find us and is a blessing to our Hope is Here ministry team and financial ministry partners. Well, today I want to look at the man who redefined forgiveness. Oh, my goodness. I know when you hear that word forgive, just sometimes makes us cringe because there's somebody that we know God wanted us to forgive and we haven't. And yet I also know, as I share on Hope is Here quite often, that the number one thing I've learned in ministry is that people are harder on themselves than God is, and they have problems forgiving themselves. And so I'm thankful that you can be forgiven, and just that Jesus paved the way for that. And that's why as we're celebrating Easter, that we know that the tomb was empty and death was conquered. And Jesus on the cross said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And we're going to be talking about that more today and tomorrow. But, you know, we talk about the word forgiveness. Few words sound as spiritual and also feel as impossible as forgiveness. I mean, you know, it's one of the most admired virtues in the world, and yet it's one of the least practiced. We love forgiveness, and yet when we're the ones who need it, right? Yeah, we always love forgiveness when we're the ones that need it, but when we've been deeply hurt, betrayed, or lied to, or mistreated, forgiveness suddenly becomes far more complicated, doesn't it? For many people, forgiveness feels like, we're just letting someone off the hook. It feels like pretending something didn't happen. It feels like minimizing the pain, and it feels like surrendering justice. So, friends, here's what I know. Jesus redefined forgiveness. Jesus showed that forgiveness is not excusing evil. It is refusing to let evil control your heart. Lewis Smead said, to forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover that the prisoner was you. Ouch. So much truth in that, friends. But here's what I know, friends. Many of us are carrying wounds that happened years ago. Words that still echo, betrayals that still sting our hearts, and moments that we just wish we could erase from our minds. Yet Jesus teaches us something really radical. Forgiveness is not something God asks from us. It is something God gives us so that we can live free. Say that word free with me. Free. One more time. Free. Friends, that's why Jesus came. The Bible predicted in Isaiah that Jesus would come to set the captives free. And I really believe in this series today and tomorrow that, man, if you'll just open your heart's and mind, that Jesus wants to help heal you as you forgive yourself and maybe somebody else or several other people that have hurt you. So in the time we have remaining today and tomorrow, I want to look at 4 different things that the Bible shares about forgiveness. The first one, we're going to start off with good old Peter. Oh, my goodness. Anybody like Peter ever had that gift of sticking your foot in your mouth? Oh, man, Peter was never at a loss for words. So good old Peter, always outspoken, said In Matthew chapter 18, verse 21, he went up to Jesus and said, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? And Peter probably thought he was being incredibly generous. In Jewish teaching of that day, forgiving someone 3 times was considered sufficient. But Peter doubles it and even adds 1. He's like, man, I'm being a super, follower of Jesus. Not only I'm doubling what, is asked of the custom, I'm even adding a bonus forgiveness. So you can imagine Peter's kind of expected Jesus to say, man, what a wonderful, generous spirit you have, Peter. But instead, Jesus replies differently. Verse 22 of Matthew chapter 18, Jesus said, Peter, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Either way, Jesus is not giving a number. He's describing a posture. Peter wanted a limit, and Jesus removed the ledger. Let me say it again. Peter wanted a limit. After I've done this, then I'm good on forgiveness, right? But Jesus removes that ledger, that count, okay? Peter's asking, basically, Jesus, when have I forgiven enough? But the way Jesus is answering, friends, forgiveness is not something you count. It's something you become. I'll say that again, friends. Forgiveness is not something you count. It's something you become. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, forgiveness is not an occasional act. It is a permanent attitude. Love that quote. Forgiveness is not an occasional act. It's a permanent attitude, by Martin Luther King Jr. But John Ortberg, as he talks about in his book, Who Is This Man? Forgiveness isn't a quota. It's a lifestyle. The second thing that I think we can learn from the Bible about forgiveness is that story in Matthew chapter 18, starting in verse 23, about the parable of the unforgiving servant. Jesus shared the story. He said, therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when the servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and he began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged, be patient with me, and then I will pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay back the debt. When the other servants saw what happened, they were outraged, and they went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said. I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In his anger, the master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all that he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. All right, let's recap that, friends. Okay? The servant owes his king 10,000 talents. In modern terms, this means he owed millions. Who knows, maybe even $1 billion back then. I mean, it's an impossible debt to pay back. The servant falls to his knees and begs for mercy, and something shocking happens. The king cancels the entire debt, gone, completely forgiven. But then the story takes a dark turn. That same servant goes out and finds another servant who owes him 100 denarii, a few dollars compared to the first debt. Instead of showing mercy, he grabs him by the throat and demands payment. Jesus intentionally contrasts the debts. One debt is crushing, the other is small. And the point is clear, okay? The point is clear, friends. And I love how John Ortberg describes this. He says, when we forget how much we've been forgiven, we become far less willing to forgive others. Ouch. Let's say it again. When we forget how much we've been forgiven, we become far less willing to forgive others. C.S. Lewis said, to be a Christian means to forgive the inexcusable because God has forgiven the inexcusable in you. You know, one of the most powerful examples of forgiveness I've ever heard is with Joyce Meyer and a story about her dad. Joyce Meyer, a person that's had a lot of influence on my life back when I honestly didn't know if I was going to be able to make it. When I was hanging on by a string over 20 years ago, I used to listen to her on the radio on WJMM from 10 to 10:15. And it was so powerful that sometimes I'd take my break at work at 10 o'clock, because this is back in 2001. And so wasn't like streaming now and podcasts and all that. And I would take my break from work and listen to it almost every day if possible. And she would just speak to me, just words of encouragement. I read her book, The Battlefield of the Mind, which has just been revised a couple years ago because it had sold over 500,000 copies over the 30 years that it had been written. And that was a game changer. It's one of my top 10 books. But Joyce Meyer shares a story that as a child and a teenager, her dad sexually violated her numerous times, and probably well over 100 times easily, she said. And yet, you know, she got married, like I think at 17 or 18, and, you know, just so she'd get out of her house to avoid that. Just the first boy, man, that would even have her. And of course, that ended in a divorce, but she just had to get out of that unhealthiness. Well, fast forward, 50 years later, her dad, mom are in bad health, and God said, Holy Spirit said, you need to take your parents and let them live with you. You've got a nice house, and you need to take them in. She's like, there's no way. You know what my dad did to me? He said, I know, but I've forgiven you for a lot, so I want you to do that. So after kind of fighting with God with it for a while, she finally surrendered and let her dad and mom move in with her, even though, you can just imagine how painful that was for her, knowing what he had done to her as a child and teenager. And so through that time, she just loved him like Jesus, asked us to, and the Bible asks us to. And eventually, after being there for a few months, her dad one day just started crying, which he was not an emotional guy at all, and asked for forgiveness, what he had done to her as a child. And then he said, I've been watching you and listening, and, I need to accept Jesus, but I know I can't ask for his forgiveness till I ask for yours. And so he accepted Jesus, she forgave him, and she wound up baptizing her dad. Now, friends, there's other powerful stories, but that's one that just when you talk about, I can't forgive somebody. If Joyce Meyer could forgive her dad for that, friends, I know that you can relate to that. You're like, you know what, I need to forgive somebody too. And here's what I know, friends. When we have unforgiveness, it's just like carrying a backpack full of rocks. Every hurt, every insult, every betrayal, we just keep adding stones in that backpack, and it gets really heavy, and eventually we're exhausted. But here's the truth, friends: the person who hurt you, they're not carrying that backpack. Those people aren't at all. You are. So, friends, today, please understand that Jesus is not minimizing your pain. He's just revealing the cost of holding on to it. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I hope you'll join us again tomorrow as we'll continue talking about the man who redefined forgiveness. My name's Greg Horn, and you've been listening to Hope is Here.